So now on to our speaker. Dr. Felicia Wusong is professor of sociology at Westmont College in California. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Virginia, a bachelor's in history, which I'm a historian, so that's music to my ears, from Yale, a master's in communication study from Northwestern, and before coming to Westmont in 2013, she previously taught at Louisiana State University. Her research interests include the digital technology industry, as well as how the adoption of social media technologies in particular shape the landscapes of our families, our communities, our organizational lives, and education. She's the author of the book Virtual Communities, Bowling Alone Online Together, which was published in 2009. And I should also mention that Dr. Song is our Dr. Fred Smith Visiting Scholar for the fall, which means that she got to enjoy lunch today with all of our fellows, discussing some of these same topics of how do we relate well as Christians to communications technology. And we want to thank the family of Dan and Jane Taylor for helping to make possible this visit. So would you all please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Song, welcoming her to the University of Minnesota.
All right, good evening. Can you hear me okay in the back? All right. Thanks so much for coming out. It's really an honor to be invited to speak to you. It's my first time in Minnesota, so I'm really excited to see so much green. And I really want to thank the team at Anselm House for this opportunity to share these reflections and ideas about social media with you tonight. So as an introduction, I want to start by not talking about technology, but about one of my favorite topics, food. So eat food, not too much, mostly plants. These are the words that begin Michael Pollan's book, In Defense of Food and Eater's Manifesto. They function as the backbone to his proposal that we become more thoughtful about what and why we eat. And on the surface, this directive to eat food seems a bit odd, since eating is a biological necessity. We usually don't have to be told. However, his emphasis is less on the word eat and more on the word food. That is, make sure that when you eat, you are consuming food, not just processed food products like margarine, low-fat this, fat-free that, but what he calls real food, like plants, animals, and grains. So in this manifesto, Pollan brings to light how most of our food consumption is defined by the modern food industry and its nutritionism, the tendency to see eating as merely an act of fueling up on the right vitamins. Whether we are reducing our intake of red meat or trying to increase our fiber, Pollan goes on to show that too often such recommendations are not necessarily grounded in sound scientific data, but rather promoted by vested interests, like the meat or corn industries. So he pushes back against the industrialization of food in the United States and calls his readers to stop counting calories and begin to realize that food is also significantly about nature, about family, about seasonality, about cultural identity. And with the rise of farmers markets, CSAs, and farm-to-table cuisine, we can see that Pollan is hardly alone in his efforts to push back against the taken-for-granted industrialization of our food. This evening, I want to propose that just as we have been sold food-like substances purporting to be better than the vegetation and grains of old, we have also been sold dazzling relationship-like moments, often purported to be better than the embodied relationships of old. In the same way that our contemporary modes of agriculture are the result of a long string of decisions made by various food and agricultural industries, governments, and global markets, our social interactions are increasingly mediated by digital platforms that are, in fact, the product of decades of decisions made by Silicon Valley, telecommunication companies, legislative and government agencies, and social media startups searching for new and efficient ways to monetize our most basic needs for relationship and belonging. Much as viewing food as merely a vehicle for nutrition destroys the most generative and delightful aspects of our humanity, so too does viewing communication as merely a vehicle for social influence or reputation maintenance. We, in our human desires for love and acceptance, may turn to social media platforms to maintain and enhance our relationships and social ties, but we forget so often that our favorite sites traffic not in relationships, but in the data they collect from us. So many of us create new accounts. We click through the terms of agreement on read, and we forget that we have agreed to let these corporations collect a priceless trail of indicators signaling our desires and our preferences. We prefer not to concern ourselves with how that data is aggregated and sold to third-party agents, whether they be advertisers tasked to sell widgets or hostile countries looking to swing votes. We prefer not to think about the fact that we are carrying out our relationships in these proprietary spaces that are designed to cost us both our data and also our attention. Social media is an industry that has squarely adopted the well-worn revenue model of selling our eyeballs to advertisers and marketers. Deeply invested in the attention economy, the social media industry devotes itself to figuring out how to attract and retain more of our attention, both on a daily basis and from cradle to grave, as they like to put it. As a result, the most successful of social media platforms take great pains to develop algorithms that process through the data we give off and calculate the optimal way to keep us tethered to their site. Since scientists have sounded the alarm on how our brains are physiologically hooked on dopamine hits with each digital notification we receive, and notably, some scientists have sounded the alarm on how our brains are physiologically hooked on these dopamine hits with each digital notification we receive, and notably how that basic neurological mechanism mirrors that which is found in gambling and alcohol addiction. Other observers use even stronger language to describe social media as a system of continuous behavior modification, pointing to Silicon Valley's blatant reliance on strategies of behavioral psychology to draw us into their sites and then keep us there, particularly when we are feeling lonely or depressed. Now, while most of us remain blissfully unaware of these experiments in emotional engineering when we are on social media, where we are subject to the fine-tuned manipulations of our vulnerabilities from the other side of the screen, what makes this entire setup so messy and complicated is that this isn't a simple matter of us victims and them Silicon Valley, aka the evil empire. Right? Rather, in this world of social media, where each of us is both consumer and producer, we find ourselves just as entangled in efforts to drive traffic to our content and commodify our existing social ties. Now, don't get me wrong, the benefits that emerge from the industrialization of our relationships and our social networks are for real. Today, it is most certainly easier to connect with known friends and find new ones than it was years ago when we were limited to the list of names in our Rolodex. Some of us might remember what that is, or those who lived in our geographic proximity. The care and support that we can extend and receive through social media is a genuine blessing. The range and scope of new voices that can be heard online is inspiring and freeing. The capacity to generate attention towards necessary causes that promise justice and healing, such as the Me Too and Church Too movements, are remarkable to witness. Social media does grant us convenient contact with people we admire, people who make us laugh, people who make us feel good about ourselves in a way that magically defies physical space and time of day, making social media delightful, comforting, and satisfying. And yet, we are naive if we don't seriously weigh these genuine gains against the genuine losses that we inevitably incur with any significant shift in our technological ecology. We are naive if we don't seriously consider what it means that we now live in an age when our touch points for relationships are increasingly constituted by industrialized experiences through social media more than any other. So, let's talk about industrialization, a little sociology lesson here, okay? So since the Industrial Revolution, societies have been working through the growing pains that have accompanied the rise of mechanized manufacturing and the maturation of an economic society that lubricates efficient production and consumption. With the benefits of 21st century hindsight, we can see that industrialization is a process that cuts both ways. Incredible gains in the standards of living and the distribution of health and educational services are evidence of the sure benefits, and yet we all know that there is a shadow side of industrialization as well. Challenges of pollution, corruption, and the cruelest effects of the expanding disparities of wealth and poverty. Sociologists have long observed the logic and techniques of bureaucracies, assembly lines, and corporate management, and have voiced concern over its unintended consequences that dehumanize the persons in these systems. Max Weber, in particular, was worried that the spirit of industrialization would increasingly cross over into the historically non-economic spheres of modern life, and he feared that the entirety of our lives would become subsumed under the iron cage of rationality. This term rationality he used to refer to principles of letting efficiency and productivity be the goals of any endeavor. In the 1990s, George Ritzer applied Weber's theory to the modern-day exemplar of industrialization, the fast food chain McDonald's. He argued that the very features that led to McDonald's success in becoming a cultural icon and global empire were the same dimensions of industrialization that motivate such negative outcomes as mediocre products and work performance, infuriating systems of red tape, and the de-skilling and dehumanization of workers and consumers. Now, what makes all of this analysis of industrialization worrisome is not that we get an inferior hamburger, but that because of the fast food chain's success, we actually now live in a world where what he calls McDonaldization occurs, where more and more of our social life and our institutions are striving to be like McDonald's. And so we have McDonaldized religion, McDonaldized education, McDonaldized sports, etc. And our contemporary life looks more and more like the iron cage of rationality that Weber warned of over 100 years ago. So tonight, what I want to try to do here is extend Ritzer's model of McDonaldization and his analysis of industrialization to social media, and propose 4 new industrializing characteristics drawing on Ritzer: the drive to quantify, the drive to perform, the drive to reify, and the drive to control. And I want to explore how the spirit of industrialization is now shifting the very terms of our fundamental experiences of relationships through social media. Okay? So first, the drive to quantify. If we stop and think about social media, there is something odd about the fact that we spend a fair bit of time on these digital platforms that keep a running and public tally of followers, friends, likes, shares, posts, comments. And that these numerical records then function to indicate the value of what we and others have shared online. Of course, it sounds silly and perhaps even pathetic to suggest that we actually base our sense of self or our social standing on these numbers. But how many of us can honestly say that we aren't mildly injured when few people, or God forbid, no one, gives our post a thumbs up? Right? How many of us can honestly say we don't feel a jolt of satisfaction when someone finds so much value added in what we have all offered on the altar of social media that they actually share or retweet it? In its dedication to collecting data about us, the social media industry is perpetually framing and infusing our social experiences with numbers. And this is very curious, right? Especially for Americans, because Americans are generally afraid of math classes. I know many of you are not, but generally afraid of math classes and big numbers. We seem pretty, for that kind of people, we seem pretty comfortable navigating an online environment that publicly enumerates the impact of our digital utterances. Now, certainly, if we think about the gamification of our fitness, our productivity, our diets, on a wide range of lifestyle websites and online communities, we see how use of numbers, right, can demonstrate how powerful the quantification of intangible realities can be as it presses us towards positive ends by tapping into our human tendencies to enjoy rewards and fear punishments. However, the impulse to begin gamifying our identities or our social lives can lead to outcomes that tilt towards benefiting the social media platforms and harming us as individuals and communities. Whether we have paid a service to generate a clout number that sums up our degree of digital influence, or we are simply looking at how many likes our latest tweet has received, we and our fragile egos often use these numbers to tell us something about our popularity, the degree to which we matter in the world, or even the degree to which we exist. And if we are particularly vulnerable because we are depressed or lonely, young, still gestating a sense of identity, or simply having a bad day, we can easily fall into the trap of comparing our numbers with other people's numbers and feeling jealous and frustrated about ourselves, and in some deep subconscious way becoming more and more enmeshed in the boundaryless system that is social media. Can we be so confident as to assert that our imaginations and appetites are not shaped in some small but substantive way by what the industry has defined as important? Which begs the question, what is important? Does having a large number around my profile say something meaningful about the quality of relationships I participate in or the quality of person I am becoming? As social media platforms perpetually update our numbers, so too do we perpetually check our numbers. And when we check, what exactly are we looking for? Is it an assurance of belonging? Is it a form of legitimacy? Is it looking to see if we are desired? These are all under this drive to quantify. All right, another industrializing feature of today's social media is the drive to perform. Our social media platforms, interestingly, are spaces designed with the effect of leveling out the actual hierarchy of friends and contacts we have in our lives. With the exception of direct messaging someone, whenever we post or tweet something online, there is no distinction between whether we are expressing ourselves to our closest friend, our great aunt, the cool acquaintance we have always admired, our boss from work, or that old classmate we haven't seen since high school. In social media, all the varied contexts of our social interactions can become collapsed into one setting. And so when we communicate through social media, our dominant mode of self-expression leans towards broadcasting rather than relational communication. For in a social space constructed to cut off and paralyze our capacity to activate the appropriate sense of intimacy, exclusivity, or context that inherently characterizes the wide range of human relationships we have, we are left with only one option: to perform our lives for mass consumption. Now, in the same way that many of us learned the norms of social behavior through observing what happened on the school playground, we pick up on what types of tweets or posts are popular, which ones draw undesirable fire, and which ones get ignored. We quickly learn that the ability to create a cleverly constructed hashtag that condenses an entire argument into a lexical punch in the face is more greatly rewarded than a lengthy but carefully nuanced claim that appreciates the complexity of an issue. Right? We get that. With everyone's utterance publicly tagged with some key numbers, we are driven to perform in order to motivate more likes as a way to establish our bona fides in a digital playground that is brimming with other people shouting for attention. Rather than revealing the mundane or negative, we feel the drive to selectively broadcast the positive, or what we imagine as the presentable aspects of our lives for all to see. And interestingly, the more we consume and take cues from the relentless public and instantaneous social feedback loop of likes and retweets that envelops each other's performances, the more homogeneous and predictable our performances become. With each responsive click of the thumbs up button to express our support or acknowledgement of social significance, we inadvertently socialize each other into performing set pieces of appearing happy and relaxed on summer vacations, possessing whimsical but sophisticated taste over some special breakfast or coffee, or feeling sentimental and proud when our child reaches a milestone like starting kindergarten or going to prom. Right? By itself, the drive to perform is nothing new. Right? Back in the 1960s, sociologist Irving Goffman observed how we as social beings all engage in acts of impression management. He believed that we all regularly engage in maintaining carefully groomed front stage performances, reserving our backstage behaviors for those we can trust with our raw, uncensored selves. He even argued that our performances are chosen from an existing set of cultural tropes: the dutiful son, the loyal friend, the accommodating employee, in order to favorably control and manage what other people think of us. But there's something unique about the degree to which our social media performances are circumscribed by pre-designed digital expressions that give us the capacity to over-enhance our performances at will. This is the industrialization part. With great ingenuity, social media platforms shave down the phenomenological experience of embodied or oral communication to a mere click of a prepackaged icon. They supply us with an automated toolkit of emojis and online gestures to help us navigate a social environment that is stripped of the complicated dance of verbal and nonverbal cues and the subtle pitch and tone of someone's voice commonly exchanged in face-to-face or voice settings. When we all use these templates, social media feeds take on the likeness of fashion runways where we all become consumers of each other's curated collection of stylized and scripted life moments, carefully filtered Instagram photos, and painfully crafted expressions of spontaneity. Right? Is it any wonder, then, that when immersed in a social environment filled with easily constructed and hyped up versions of people's lives, that the drab reality of our actual lives appear comparatively pathetic and even intolerable, especially to those in our communities who are still growing into themselves and in search of their tribe. Even if we know deep down how false or misleading the social media circus really is, it is not surprising that the fear of missing out and the social suffering that comes with that fear drives us to keep checking our feeds for the latest update. And again, when we do, we usually find that when we look to social media to quench our FOMO, our thirst is merely exasperated. The winner in the end is none of us. It is the social media companies. They benefit from how we turn to their platforms to assuage our pain and our longings. Okay, third, the drive to reify. So the fun of social media is that, like satellite TV or a Las Vegas buffet, there's always something new to consume. Unlike the scarcity of relationships that humans have historically had to make do with, the blessing of social media is the promise of abundance. Unfortunately, like many things in life, the blessing also becomes the curse. As we typically straddle multiple platforms each day, the sheer volume of interaction and content that we are privy to forces us to develop and master standard techniques of management. In order to process through the ceaseless stream of messages, we selectively read, delete, ignore, or skip through our feeds and our inboxes and notifications. This quandary of abundance drives us towards what Georg Lukács called reification, a process where a relation between people takes on the character of a thing. So through reification, I move closer to treating the dynamic between you and me as a thing. And I become inclined to objectify the people I love and the messages they post as mere tasks to complete, or as a means to be used or manipulated to boost my numbers and my ego. Through reification, I relate less and I broadcast more. Through reification, I mechanize the complex dance that social interaction involves and prefer the prepackaged templates of emojis and likes. When that dynamic between you and me become closer to a thing, I can more easily go onto Instagram or Twitter and gossip, announce a milestone, compliment, or heap verbal violence upon another with little or no sensation of emotional cost that I would need to contend with in the former age of bodies and voices. Another effect of this overflow of content in our feeds and the drive to reify is that we find ourselves in a state of being chronically behind and relentlessly chased by a nagging sense of our time poverty and a constant urge to keep up with our feeds, tweets, emails, and texts. In this, we discover that the very technology that promises to help us get organized, efficiently deliver in our relationships, has merely exposed us to the avalanche of unprioritized requests and demands upon our attention. We never have enough time, and our postures towards relationality begins to bend more and more towards a managerial stance of monitoring and surveilling. Our consciousness gradually becomes accustomed to being in a latent or active state of always catching up, and the more we objectify the content of our feeds, the more we go through our days with this pressing anxiety to keep up. And again, if we step back and we begin to realize that our social media platforms gain nothing in attempting to resolve our fear or our sense of time poverty, but benefit wholly from stoking those fears so that we keep coming back, then we should be asking the unsettling question of whether our experience of the social has not only become industrialized in its felt experience, but also become industrialized as a means of profit for someone else's gain. Okay, my last point here, the drive to control. Now, in the industrialization of food, for the sake of efficiency and productivity, decisions are made early on about what part of a food is considered waste. The heads and innards of animals, the tops of carrots and radishes, the rinds of cheeses. These are all chopped off, thrown out, sent off to be processed in ways that are unseemly to consider in polite company. This drive to control the final product is mechanized and preemptive. As we get habituated into the industrialized ecology of social media, where we take for granted the quest to become more efficient and better trained in our drives to quantify and reify, we also begin to subconsciously believe that we ought to optimize every moment and cut out whatever is considered waste. What is the waste then? What's curious is that one of the key things we are encouraged to view as waste is the present. The place where we are, the people we are with, the thing or task we are doing. Social media drives us to view the present as a waste. How so? So consider this. When we are working, when we are having lunch, we are watching our kids, sitting through a meeting, our social media and digital devices have trained us to become people haunted by a constant sense that maybe someone has texted, emailed, tweeted, liked something we posted. Back in 2008, before social media as we know it erupted, UVA professor of English Mark Edmondson so presciently captured this shift in consciousness when he wrote about how the availability of the internet was changing college students, he observed. So he said this: classes matter to them, but classes are just part of an ever-enlarging web of activities and diversions. Students now seek to master their work, not to be taken over by it and consumed. They want to dispatch it, do it well and quickly, then get on to the many other things that interest them. For my students live in the future and not the present. They dwell in possibility. The idea is to keep moving, never to stop. He continues to observe what all professors notice, that after class the cell phones are out. He says our students need to disperse themselves again, get away from the immediate, dissolve the present away. So what Edmondson describes here as dwelling in possibility and this desire to dissolve the present away is often the state of consciousness that so many of us, young and old, experience. We all have experienced this feeling of unease, that no matter where we are, whatever we are doing, we are potentially missing out on something more important than what we are doing right now. And so many of us share in the impulse to abide in several worlds. We do so at the risk of forgetting what life feels like to live free from these technological flows. And we are so deeply caught in the flow of social media that we begin to think and feel, as Zygmunt Bauman predicted. He said, making eye contact and thereby acknowledging the physical proximity of another human being spells waste. It portends the necessity of spending a portion of precious yet loathsomely scarce time on deep diving into embodied interaction. It's a very troubling suggestion. We all know that meaningful offline interactions take a lot of work, and that the payoff can be great. But when we are preoccupied and tired and are still looking for some kind of payoff, it is far more appealing to indulge in social media's promise of a dopamine hit and its endless supply of possibility. The promise of stumbling upon a social interaction online is easy and satisfying. To tend to those who are physically proximate to us, as Bauman writes, is a decision that would interrupt or preempt our hungry ritual of clicking through so many other potentially more interesting possibilities of social interactions. Ironically, while we can think about how social media gives us control in our relationships, it is ultimately, again, the companies that have control over us. The more we turn to social media, the less we are capable of being able to deal with real-life relationships that are so often not in our control. The more we signal how we want to control with blocks and filters, the more we give over control and let the social media algorithm determine our perceived reality without realizing how much of a filter bubble our horizons actually are. So I'm not here this evening to say that social media is the evil agent, okay? For social media merely mirrors and amplifies the dynamics of industrialization that we have been deeply immersed in for over 100, 200 years. The cultural and structural power of social media is in large part rooted in its capacity to reproduce and amplify the existing ideologies and structural realities of rationalization, consumer culture, and commodification, and the therapeutic culture. The industrialization process has long been reducing, conditioning, and training us towards a modality of the consumer, an individual with desires looking to be met at the most cost-effective, friction-free manner. The problem is that when social media becomes the primary way that we are being trained and socialized into our experience of what friendship and relationship looks like, then we risk becoming a people with a very truncated view of what it means to be in relationship with someone. For we are letting a technological structure that was designed to sell our eyeballs and our data to third-party interests become the default social space in which we are being trained to interact with friends, loved ones, colleagues, and yes, even our enemies. Most of us are so deeply immersed in it that we don't know what else it could look like. Anglican priest and author Tish Harrison Warren reminds us that Christianity is a religion that functions within a wholly different set of economic parameters than what we find in social media and in our experience of modern daily life. She writes this: "This daily formation in contemporary America is often at odds with our formation in word and sacrament. In Christianity's alternative economy of the true bread of life, we are turned inside out so that we are no longer people marked by scarcity, jockeying for our own good, but are new people, truly nourished and therefore able to extend nourishment to others. The economy of the Eucharist is true abundance. There is enough for me, not in spite of others, but because we receive Christ together as a community." I want to suggest that when we drill down to the core of Christianity, we find that rather than believing that freedom comes through social influence, attention, and dominance, genuine freedom actually comes through accepting our brokenness and vulnerability, being able to confess and receive absolution, and being capable of self-forgetfulness when we are overwhelmed by the mercy and love that God offers. When we are being deformed and beaten down by the demands of our social media to quantify, perform, reify, and control, Christianity and its new economy of miraculous, inexplicable multiplication of bread and fish is prepared with remarkable theological resources and praxis to counterform us. So, in closing, I want to go back to food. You can tell I like food. Okay. There's a chef named Dan Barber who runs Blue Hill Farm. And like Poland, he is committed to pushing back against the industrialization of our food. But for Barber, he is driven not by a commitment to a healthful diet or a particular ethic. Rather, his main passion as a chef is taste. The thing he cares most about is serving food that tastes amazing. Now, to Barber, good taste comes most naturally from untampered ingredients, and he searches out all varieties of vegetables and grains that went out of favor when they did not suit the large-scale transportation process that our food industry so heavily relies upon. Because he sees how much the food supply is distorted by the mainstream food industry, One of his goals as a chef is to cook food that reminds his customers what food can taste like. He works with farmers to raise animals and grow plants that result in the best tasting squash, the best tasting cheese, and the best tasting bread, offering tastes that his diners might never have experienced before. In this way, Dan Barber's critique of the modern food industry is all about a desire to reignite the imagination about food and how it can taste. His thoughts and feelings about food are similar to my thoughts and feelings about social media and its industrialization of our relationships. For in the same way that we may never have tasted what a squash or green bean could really be like, I wonder if we are at a point in which we may forget, or to use the food analogy, we may have lost a taste for the amazing fruit that can be born out of a social landscape where human presence is unmediated and where time and space are not our enemies but our friends. For those who profess to follow after Jesus, someone whose incarnation through a physical human presence was used to reveal the true nature of God's love, we should be seeking to imagine more deeply how to interrupt the industrializing tendencies of social media in our lives and vigilantly stake out a genuine and theologically informed vision of what it is to know and be known, so that one day we can turn to those around us and those who are just as hungry as we are and say to them, "Come, taste and see." Thanks.